And tonight, Time Shift reveals how the Edwardian Larder was surprisingly similar to ours today.
Cape Evans, Antarctica. This is the cabin where Captain Scott celebrated his last birthday. When the survivors of the British Antarctic expedition closed up the hut on January the 13th, 1913, they left behind all the supplies that were no longer needed. Inside, everything is just as Scott's comrades left it. There are relics from the ill-fated journey to the South Pole. Scientific experiments, a hot water bottle, photographic equipment. But there are splashes of colour which are more familiar. Fry's chocolate, Lyle's golden syrup, Coleman's mustard, Heinz tomato ketchup. Between these shelves and our own, there lies a century of inconceivable change, yet many of these foods are still with us.
OK, we're going to make the stop with some Marmite.
By the first years of the 20th century, our food had undergone a revolution. The British diet had become processed, factory packaged, and a new kind of product was on the rise, the brand. Some of our most iconic food brands were born in the Edwardian age.
I don't want to be downy again, but I'm not loving the look.
It isn't hugely appealing, is it, in that sense?
Their makers saw how to change perceptions and create new tastes.
And I can imagine that aiding your indigestion.
Yes.
They discovered how to use the emerging mass media.
Golfers should remember that after a foursome, to order this bottle. So there you are, you're being told to rush off to a golf club and make sure they stock Perrier water.
They built reputations with endorsement and sponsorship.
Messrs Huntley and Palmer, Ship's Biscuit, Fancy Biscuits and Cakes, and all the sledging biscuit, which stood us so well and was so conveniently packed for travelling.
So the growing power of the food brand was able to change the British diet and reach even the most remote Edwardian larder.
Little bit of flavour? Yeah. Yeah. See how it does with the milk.
These men are trying to recreate one of the most famous names from the Edwardian era. It transformed tea drinking using clever marketing to sell what was once a worthless waste product.
Actually, it's very nice with the milk.
And changed the taste of tea by using just the tips of the leaves.
I think they're both a must, aren't they? Yep. From the leaf and the liquor points of view.
In 1900, the British were buying 100,000 tonnes of tea a year, over £6 for every man, woman and child in the country. All classes regarded tea as a necessity. Into this booming market, grocer John Sumner launched Typhoo Tips Tea in 1903. Sumner was using fashionable Ceylon tea, but what made his tea special was that he used the fannings, the broken edges of the leaf.
Historically, they were trying to sell a large, neat leaf, and if these bits broke off, they were basically discarded, and at some point they were actually thrown away and put back on the field. These bits that are broken off will be the edges, and we know that that's where the quality and the flavour lies. It makes perfect sense that this would give you a much stronger, much more flavourful cup of tea than what was traditionally sold, which was the whole two-leaf in the bud, basically. So, more or less by accident, he stumbled upon this.
And what he sold it on was the fact that these small fannings, particularly from Ceylon, you could get more cups of tea per pound, he reckoned 80. There were less tannin in the tea. That meant it was better for the nervous system. And it was a relaxation drink. So these people were alert not only to creating something, but that need to flog it.
This waste tea looked and tasted very different from the tea the Victorians had been used to. Just 50 years before, 90% of what was drunk was green tea from China, and this tea was a constant source of anxiety.
The green tea in the 19th century was, as you can imagine, almost fluorescent green, as it had yellows and blue dyes in it, some of them being derivatives of copper and other kinds of chemicals that the medical community knew was quite dangerous. And the anxiety was that green tea had these dangerous chemicals added to it. Green tea developed a reputation as being a slow poison.
Typhoo's tea tasters have tracked down some teas similar to those available in Edwardian Britain.
It's quite crisp. Actually, I'm doing that an injustice. It's quite nice, isn't it? So these are a representation of today's teas, which I think are close or similar to teas that would have been on the market there. One thing that struck me first off is there's a large quantity of green teas there, which I hadn't really appreciated. So the first one we've got here is a China green hyson. That's not bad, that's quite nice. Bit raw.
It's a bit cabbagey.
Next one I've got is the adulteration of green tea made it increasingly unpopular. If the colouring didn't kill you, there was always the question of where your tea leaves had been.
Must have been at least 10 companies in London collecting tea leaves from restaurants, from hotels, and drying them and processing them and selling them as spent tea leaves, or of course passing them to adulterators who added them back into fresh tea. It was less easy to do with black tea.
Right, now we're into the black teas.
This safer reputation was one reason why, by 1900, black teas had almost completely taken over from green tea.
Right, next I've gone to Assam. I've got an orange peko, so a nice big stylish leaf. Yeah, I like that one.
That's nice, nice flavour.
Got some maltiness.
And many of these new black teas were being sold packaged by named brands, providing reassurance that their tea was pure.
The huge plus about a proprietary brand is that it's got that kind of seal of approval. It's been put together in a factory under rigorous conditions. It's been sealed, it's airtight, nobody's been able to tamper with it. That's a big worry. And so it actually seems, although it seems very odd to us, as if the proprietary brand is actually better, healthier, safer for you than something that comes straight from the farm.
It's quite nice, isn't it? It's not too dissimilar to the Assam.
Packaging his tea might provide guarantees of purity and quality, but if Sumner wanted to sell his unusual tea, he had to show people that his brand had something else to offer.
John Sumner's sister, Mary, suffered from indigestion, and she was given a sample of this sort of tea by a friend, and it cured the indigestion. She then tried it on a few of her friends, and the same thing happened. So she persuaded her brother to sell this tea. So he took a bit of a gamble and bought 30 chests.
Sumner realised he could exploit his sister's experience. Indigestion was no minor issue. It was a national obsession.
Everybody was concerned about digestion, either indigestion or constipation, the two opposite ends of the digestive process, one might say.
With little distinction between foods and medicines, Sumner was able to persuade doctors to prescribe his tea to their patients.
The foods weren't as wholesome and good as they are today. People were just very concerned with their internal organs. They wanted to make sure they were healthy. How was it that they were going to maintain their health? And digestion was a very important thing that we could easily complain about.
Having sampled a range of teas available in 1903, the tasters have recreated John Sumner's original Typhoo blend.
Well, it's got an excellent leaf appearance, which is what we were aiming
Superb.
for.
Yep.
All the small edges, as described by Mr. Sumner. That's what it tastes like. That's very nice.
It's quite smooth,
Yeah.
it's not bitter. And I can imagine that aiding your indigestion.
Yes.
Even the name Typhoo played on the medicinal uses.
It's quite a quirky name for that time. It's quite an adventurous thing to call the brand something like Typhoo. We do understand it might be Chinese for doctor, and the word tips, again, was an invention, and the spelling of it was a printer's error, so it should have originally been TIPS, but he kept that printing error just to keep the unique name. It was essential to the brand's success.
Sumner took the bold step of selling his grocery business and moving full-time into packaged tea, buying direct from plantations and packing the tea at his warehouse in Birmingham.
It's, I suppose to a small boy, the size of the factory was enormous. I always remember there was a smell of tea, which was a very nice sort of clean smell. The tea used to come down a chute, and the packet was underneath, and it was automatically weighed, and then it went on a conveyor belt, and the girls used to pack it into 20-pound parcels.
Typhoo was one of a proliferation of packet teas. These factory-made brands were having a profound effect on the traditional grocer's shop.
The whole concept of tea was that the grocer would make up the particular blend that the customer wanted. So I'll have some of number 6 and some of number 13, and that was their special blend. And the art of the grocer was to mix those successfully for his clients.
Grocers resented the companies like Typhoo that were branding their tea, especially at the beginning, because really de-skilled the grocers. So then a grocer's just a shop owner, has no particular skills.
The earliest packet teas had to be sold in chemist shops, but in the end, grocers gave in and stopped them as customers began to ask for a particular brand.
I guess the Edwardian period was the moment in which grocers were really facing off these large tea companies in this struggle.
And it wasn't just name brands putting pressure on the grocers. Grocery chains were also a threat, especially those that cut costs by selling just a few own brand foods in bulk.
One of the other factors we need to take into account was the emergence of grocery chains like Perkins, the Maypole, Home and Colonial. Chains of grocers that had their own connection with wholesaling.
Although fewer and fewer grocers blended their own teas, the skills of selecting and blending were not lost. An Edwardian grocer would find Typhoo's modern tasting rooms distinctly familiar.
From the photographs that we've seen from the time, this part of the process has remained virtually unchanged. Still using the same scales, and we're still using the same tasting crockery. We still today use silver sixpences as the main unit of measure. A small cup would have 1 sixpence. This cup, which is a large cup, would have 2 sixpences. The purpose of the tasting is to ensure that you're getting your blend identical. So even though some of the components may change due to seasonality, the product that goes on the shelf every week tastes exactly the same. So the main reason between all this effort goes into ensuring consistency of the product.
Strangely, today's Typhoo doesn't taste or look at all like John Sumner's original Ceylon blend. Now it contains African and Indian teas. So what has continued? It's a testament to the strength of the brand that the one thing that hasn't changed is the Typhoo name.
Let's see how it fares against today's blend. It's much more strong there, isn't it?
It's much more astringent, yes, there's more.
Well, today's blend will have a lot of African teas,
Yes,
from Kenya.
quite right. Which do you prefer?
Oh, I think I prefer the other one. But then again, I like Ceylon tea.
Mineral water may be everywhere now, but it seems like a recent addition to British tables. And when we drink a glass of Perrier, we like to think we're sipping a little bit of French sophistication. In fact, Perrier is not quite as French as it seems, and when it launched in 1903, it was the British who were buying it. The man behind the brand was St John Harmsworth, the handsome sixth son of one of the most influential families in England, the creators of the Daily Mail. Vivian Harmsworth is St John's great-nephew, and he still works for the Mail.
I first became aware of the connection through my grandfather, who actually was on the board at Perrier throughout his life, and I remember him he was in his 80s when I was 12, and he died shortly afterwards. But so Perrier was always very much something pointed out to me by the family. You know, your great-uncle started that.
St John's brother Alfred, later Lord Northcliffe, was a pioneering journalist who, in 1896, founded the Daily Mail. It became Britain's first mass newspaper.
He saw the importance of it since the Education Act of 1880, when it became compulsory for everybody to read in school. And he soon discovered the vacuum that was for women readers. So he produced the Daily Mail as the great sort of national newspaper, really for women. Later produced the Daily Mirror in 1903, which was actually produced by women too. So he saw that, and I think Daily Mail is very much the same now. It has a great appeal to women.
In 1902, Alfred Harmsworth decided to launch a French edition of the Daily Mail, and 25-year-old St John was sent off to France to learn the language.
Well, he went to France. He went down to Nîmes, and it was there where he met Dr. Perrier, who at that time was the owner of this rather small spring at which Hannibal is said to have stopped with his elephants and filled himself with gas and water before crossing the Pyrenees.
It was a fortunate meeting. St John, a wealthy young man looking for a project, Dr. Perrier, the owner of an ailing spa. So St John sold his shares in the Daily Mail and, to the shock of his family, took over the spring. He abandoned its therapeutic treatments and concentrated instead on bottling the water.
Clearly, every population is concerned with what they drink, and there have been many cases of huge diseases being spread through the waters, typhoid and so on. So the quality of water is important. Most good families would have their own water filter, but if you bought something bottled, and particularly if it comes from a spa or something else, you kind of guaranteed that this was safe. So the mineral water industry was certainly booming. There were a huge number of spa waters, and these things were marketed very successfully.
The problem was, in the early 1900s, more and more cities were providing clean piped water, and spas were going out of fashion. So St John needed to find another way of selling his water.
He gets credit for designing the Perrier bottle. Its design was specific because the water he was bottling was gaseous, it had gas in it, and had to be strong because there was a history of bottles like that exploding. He designed it in a cool green colour, in the shape of the clubs which he used for exercising, so it had no shoulders to it because the shoulders were weak in gaseous bottles.
There were other technical innovations too.
Around this time, 1903, the crown cap, the new invention for sealing the bottle, was really coming into place, but now is being employed for quite a number of new products coming onto the market, and Perrier is one of them. It was a much more convenient form of opening. It was advertised as being opened by a woman, whereas before they thought only a man could draw a cork out of a bottle.
The bottle was expensive to make, 2/3 of the cost of production of the water, but St John understood that the bottle was as important as its contents.
He designed the labels, and I think he was actually working in Paris when he did this, and had trouble in designing a label which fitted onto a round bottle. I can imagine the trials of doing this.
Production of Perrier in the new bottles started in 1903. Sales grew quickly, but bottling was slow, and someone had to stick all those labels on by hand.
I've never noticed that before. I don't think that's probably been discontinued, hasn't it? It's probably because it's stamped on the bottom is Perrier, surrounded a star. I think they'd probably fall modern, nice. The contents, of course, obviously went down well, and probably some upmarket nice thing to have, a new product to have on the table.
The choice of the name was also important. It wasn't just a touching tribute to Dr. Perrier. There was also Perrier Jouet champagne. It had no connection with St. John's water, but it was selling almost 1 million bottles a year in Britain, a useful association if you want to sell the champagne of table waters.
There's a sense amongst a bit of the middle class, the bit that's very aspirational, that thinks anything French is fancy, anything French is good. And he markets Perrier very much on its Frenchness, its sense not just that it's good for you, but the sense that there's something about Frenchness and French water that's particularly refined, that has a kind of particular magical blend of minerals that's going to do wonders for poor old British digestions.
All this helped to create an image of Perrier as elite and desirable. And when our new love of France was affirmed in 1908 by the Franco-British exhibition held in London to celebrate the Entente Cordiale, it proved the perfect opportunity for Perrier, who spurned the main food hall and built their own much-praised pavilion. But the French image was not for French consumption. 93% of bottles sold went to England and America. St. John achieved this with some strategic advertising in his brother's newspaper, the Daily Mail.
There you go. Full page.
And that's wonderful.
This is June 1906.
Just 3 years after the purchase.
3 years after the purchase. We've got a map here showing where the water was produced, and on this side we can see how much it cost to buy. So in those days it was 4.5 old pence.
What about that today?
And that would be about £1.30, £1.32
really?
Today.
Yes, it's still quite expensive.
Yes.
I mean, a full page, how much that cost, do you think?
Well, when the Mail was launched in 1896, the early price of a page, a full front page, was about £75. If you were able to buy a full front page of the Daily Mail now, which you couldn't, but an inside page would cost you about £30,000. So try it alone or with a slice of lemon.
St. John spent vast sums on publicity for his water, and where better to advertise than in the paper with the highest circulation in the world.
It's a realisation there's a mass market there. Advertising in local newspapers is no longer adequate. It's the national paper that everybody has to be. The newspaper is a more direct way of reaching this mass market. And certainly companies are becoming much more aware in the Edwardian period that mass advertising is to do with slogans, it's to do with images. So a lot of the advertising in this period, I think, becomes highly aspirational.
As an enthusiastic sportsman himself, St. John enlisted the sporting heroes of the day to endorse his product, from the Cambridge rowing crew to top cricketers.
Let's have a look at this then. And what athletes have Perrier?
Yeah.
But I see he's got, I mean, the most magnificent names here. Jackson Cricket, McLaren, captained England, C.B. Fry, captain England. Jackson was wonderful, I think, because I think he had Churchill as his fag at Harrow.
Really?
So they've got to get on well together.
Even better, Perrier had the support of the royal family.
This advert's interesting because apart from the health advice and how much it is, but there's also a picture of a horse called Perrier, who's described as the Derby favourite.
And that was owned by the king at the time, presumably, which was Edward VII. What happened?
The horse disappeared without trace, which is hardly surprising. If you look at the picture, it's a very scrawny nag, but
yes.
It shows the support of the royal household to the product, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Brands should wait 3 years before putting the royal warrant on the label. Perrier did it immediately. But all this publicity became a bit of a problem. Perrier couldn't bottle water fast enough to meet demand.
I think it was very successful in the initial stages by the enthusiasm of St. John. His main problem was, he said, and is chronicled as saying, that he could sell twice as many bottles of Perrier water as he could supply, but the great A drawback of it was actually the manufacture of the bottles, and that caused a lot of problems.
St. John was reliant on a limited supply of bottles manufactured for Perrier in Marseille and on outdated filling equipment at the spa itself. Then, in July 1906, everything changed. At the age of 30, St. John had a terrible car accident. He survived, but would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair.
I think he got great strength from the family who rallied round him, and I've seen correspondence from them between the brothers saying, you know, we're very worried about St. John, what are we going to do about him?
St. John's brothers, eager to help him, became actively involved in the Perrier business, and with their backing, St. John began to invest in state-of-the-art bottling technology. Perrier became a spectacular success. The green bottle replaced soda siphons on aristocratic tables and spread throughout the British Empire, selling 10 million bottles a year by 1914. And St. John continued to swim in a Perrier-filled swimming pool for the rest of his days. St. John's family connections meant he could quickly link Perrier to the rich and famous, but other brands also saw the benefits of a little celebrity endorsement.
If you get the King's coat of arms on your product, wow, that meant the King's drinking or eating this. How good is that?
Famous names increasingly featured in advertising.
This goes back certainly to the 1860s and the 1870s and the 1880s when people like W.G. Grace was promoting mustard, Coleman's mustard.
The Edwardians took endorsement a step further, forging a still closer relationship between well-known public figures and brands. In 1895, Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen set out to reach the North Pole. His attempt failed, but the media attention it won was irresistible to advertisers. The public imagination was caught by the race to reach the poles.
Early in the first decade of the 20th century, the news came out from America that Admiral Peary had claimed to reach the North Pole. And at that point, all that remained was the South Pole.
Captain Scott took up the challenge. His British Antarctic expedition of 1910 is perhaps the most famous of all polar attempts. It was to prove fatal for Scott himself, but the hut Scott used as a base still remains.
I visited Captain Scott's hut in the early 1980s at the end of a journey where we completed the first ever crossing of the whole of Antarctica from one side to another. When I went inside the hut, I immediately was struck by the fact that a lot of the, must have been from the Edwardian period, the food products and the drink powder and so on and so forth, were in many cases from companies still very active today, and lots of the companies between then, back in the first decade of the century, and the 1980s hadn't changed their advertising labels and the brand names at all over those 70 years.
From early on, Scott was a pioneer, not just in exploration, but in the realm of publicity. This fashion parade of Edwardian foodstuffs was donated to Scott's expedition by manufacturers eager for exposure.
Scott's expedition, and 70 years after Scott, my own expeditions, all of us from the UK depended entirely upon sponsorship. I raised £29.5 million worth in the early 70s in kind of sponsors.
On Scott's Antarctic expedition of 1902, only 3 companies had given supplies for free. But for food brands keen to advertise their nutritious and sustaining food, a share of Scott's limelight was invaluable.
And one of the things which he did, which clearly did work well, was to make sure that if a company, shall we say Huntley and Palmer's Biscuits, sponsored him, he really did what he said he would do when asking for the biscuits in the first place, which was, we will photograph your biscuits against iceberg backgrounds. And when he got back from his expedition, he duly handed over the photographs which could then be used and was worth a lot of money.
So by 1910, all the expedition's food was given for free. Commander Evans, who survived the polar trip, made sure to thank their sponsors.
Perhaps it would not be out of place to mention here some of the great firms who were selected to supply us with provisions. Messrs. J.S. Fry & Sons supplied all our cocoa, sledging and fancy chocolate, delicious comforts, excellently packed and always in good condition. Messrs. Huntley and Palmer.
Scott and his colleagues were travelling in an age when understanding of nutrition was limited and vitamins unknown.
He knew nothing about the polar areas at all. He knew nothing about what sort of food to eat down there. He had to make up his mind what he thought would be best. Messrs. Price's Patent Candle Company Limited, candles which were purposefully made edible, though never eaten. And he chose various things. He thought, well, when we're not travelling, and most of the time in Antarctica you're waiting for travelable conditions, you've got to keep the people happy. So Scott's answer was to get lots of tobacco, lots of pipe tobacco, lots of rum and brandy and luxurious foods and Shipham's meat pastes and things like that. And that's what he did. And Messrs. Simon Brothers of Northumberland Avenue, Champagne, Moët Chandon, Courvoisier, Cognac and all liqueurs. The brandy was particularly well put up in suitable bottles for sledging.
Yet Scott and his party died of starvation and exhaustion just 11 miles from a food storage depot and 120 miles from their hut. Given the tragedy, few have remembered Scott's clever use of sponsors when planning his expedition. Fry's Cocoa even used Scott in their advertising after his death. He had taken well over a ton of cocoa to Antarctica, and the drink was widely regarded as an essential, providing both warmth and sustenance.
Throughout the 19th century, people were really enjoying drinking chocolate. They were drinking cocoa and so on. But over that period, towards the end of the 19th century, they were engaging in bar chocolate. Now, this was developing, but it was dark chocolate, and it was a luxury, undoubtedly, quite expensive. But then came this big moment when milk chocolate arrived around the turn of the century, around 1900. And one of the first brands to engage in this was Fry's Five Boys. They promoted it, this very famous Five Boys advertisement, which had been going since the 1880s. And this just took on the kind of persona of this brand. So later on, they actually called it Fry's Five Boys Chocolate.
But in 1905, an even more successful milk chocolate appeared.
When Cadbury's Dairy Milk was launched, it was an experiment. There was certainly no notion, even the part of Cadbury, that this was going to be their major product. If we look at Cadbury's great rival, which is Rowntree, it actually had no interest in making milk chocolate. It believed that milk chocolate, quote, was a passing fad. It wasn't going to last.
Cadbury's was already a successful firm. They employed 2,600 workers, many of them housed at Bourneville, their pioneering model village near Birmingham. Their range of products was enormous, but before dairy milk, it was dark chocolate that led the way.
From the time Cadbury's Dairy Milk launched, and for another 20 or 30 years, it was the huge determinant product. It shaped a whole industry, and it also shaped a whole generation of consumers.
Milk chocolate emerged in the later 19th century. It really came from Switzerland, where people in Switzerland were experimenting with milk chocolate and condensing milk. George Cadbury had this idea that he wanted to bring in a desirable milk chocolate bar. So what did George do? He wasn't no mug, he went to Switzerland. And they learnt how to make Cadbury's Dairy Milk, CDM.
And what they managed to do was make a good quality milk chocolate using slightly cheaper ingredients than the Swiss, and therefore stimulating, in fact creating, actually creating this mass market in the way the Swiss have never done.
At the beginning of the 20th century, society was changing, and for the first time, mass-produced brands were finding eager buyers.
The reason it was a mass product was you've got a growing middle class with disposable income. You've got a growing upper working class, regularly employed in occupations that give some security, that have got some more disposable income. You've got a declining birth rate amongst the lower middle class and the better off of the working class, which add to the fact that people from those sections of society have got a bit more money either to have a better house to rent or to spend on luxuries.
Cadbury's understood that they needed a new form of marketing to reach these new consumers.
The strength of Cadbury's marketing strategy is that they not only invented the right type of product with the right type of quality, but they were also able to make it much more cheaply. And the more they drove the price down, the bigger the mass market, the bigger the number of consumers. And the bigger the number of consumers, the more the revenues they had and the more reason they had to advertise on a mass scale. And Cadbury's dairy milk sort of entered this virtuous circle of prices going down, of quality being highly perceived, and of mass marketing at the same time.
Lower prices, increasing wealth and persuasive advertising all created a seemingly limitless appetite for milk chocolate.
What you see quite clearly is a huge expansion of the confectionery industry, that Britons everywhere are eating more and more chocolate, more and more sweets, more and more sugar. And there's no doubt that the consumption of chocolate from about 1900 to 1913 doubles. There is no idea in the Edwardian period that chocolate and sugar is bad for you.
But then there was no obesity problem to worry about. The poor struggled to get enough of anything, and that included sugar and fat.
The Boer War, which came at the end of the century into the 20th century, became a huge shock to the middle classes because it emerged quite quickly that the working class recruits, the British Army, were terribly undersized, really poor nutrition, very few teeth between them, and there was a sudden kind of crisis and panic about, the health of the working class and how can we get them to eat better and become stronger, fitter fighting force.
And the typical meal in the working class home is going to be bread and some form of sugar. That's to say jam or syrup or treacle to spread on the bread. Even in some cases to sprinkle sugar on bread. And so people will eat tea and bread 3 times a day, and the children will come to the back door and complain that they're hungry, and mother will give them pieces of bread to take out into the street.
But don't forget, in the early 20th century, probably around a quarter of the population was poor at any one time. Now that meant that there was a large number just above the poverty line who could easily drop into poverty. For those people, buying a bar of chocolate wasn't an option. You couldn't afford to spend a penny, a halfpenny, 3 halfpence, 2pence on a bar of chocolate.
Fears about working class diet fueled a growing obsession with nutrition and the quality of food amongst all classes.
Surprisingly, the middle-class woman of the late 19th century period into the Edwardian period, very, very aware of nutrition. Now, when we look at the kind of things that she was being told, would think it's kind of pseudoscience. It doesn't quite make sense to us. But the fact is they were thinking really hard about minerals, protein content. She's really understanding now that what she puts in her family's mouth will pay off in terms of better health.
Today, the British eat around 3,500 tonnes of Marmite a year, tucking into 700 million pieces of Marmite and toast. When Marmite hit the market in 1902, it was slow to take off. Then, across Britain, it began to be recommended in vegetarian recipe books.
Today we're cooking a sea pie from the 1909 edition of the Reform Cookery Book. I don't know why it's called sea pie. There's nothing fishy in it. What it involves is it cooks with spring vegetables, and we've got swede, celeriac, parsnips, carrots, Savoy cabbage, which is a lovely looking thing, and some green beans. Basically, it's a stew with a sort of dumpling top. So you make a dumpling pastry and put it over the top and steam it for 3/4 of an hour. We're using Marmite, which was a new product for the Edwardians.
Matthew Kay is head chef at Manor Vegetarian Restaurant.
Manor is the oldest running vegetarian restaurant in London, if not England. The restaurant's been here since 1966, so it's over 40 years old now. But actually, there were vegetarian restaurants going right back into the 1850s. Let's get going. We're going to fry some onions, which help make the stock. Got the butter sizzling away. Let's get the onions in. Just want to brown them a little bit, give them a bit of colour and get some flavour in there. Basically, it's a stew cooked in a stock which is made with Marmite. At this point, I mean, there would have been some Indian influences and you've probably got a curry sauce, but there wasn't really a lot of variety in the cookery. It's a celeriac, so it's quite what we'd think of now as sort of simple, plain cookery. But it can be quite tasty. I'm just going to add these vegetables to the pan before the onions burn. So these can go in. The butter's nicely browned, which will give it a nice flavour. OK, we're going to make the stock with some Marmite, which was, you know, really adopted by the vegetarians at the time. It makes a lovely rich stock. It's yeast extract, so it's meat-free. Nice brown colour. You know, good big dollop. Give it lots of nice flavour. We probably won't need to add salt into the stock.
For such a quintessentially British product, we know surprisingly little about Marmite's early days. We don't even have the first jar.
To find an early jar of Marmite, it's extraordinary how the millions which must have been produced at one time have disappeared. So I'm still looking for many of the original items from Edwardian or Victorian days. The first Marmite jar would be absolutely brilliant to find. I can't even find one from the pre-shaped, the iconic shape which we now have Marmite in, and that arrived in 1925.
What we do know about Marmite is that it was founded for very pragmatic reasons.
The brewing industry uses yeast to ferment beer through the fermentation process. And in that process, yeast propagates itself to the point where you get an excess quantity of yeast surplus to requirements. This material was growing at a fair rate in the brewing process and becoming increasingly difficult to dispose of. And so as far as they were concerned, it was a major waste stream material that they needed to do something with.
Enter Marmite's founders, Frederick Wissler from Switzerland and George Hutt, who was German. Armed with a German patent for a process to make yeast extract, they set out to find somewhere to start their business.
The biggest brewer in the UK happened to be in Burton-on-Trent. That's the home of brewing in the UK. And as a result of that, they thought that it would be ideally placed in Burton-on-Trent, right next to the source of the material.
The next step was to use the patented method to turn this yeast into something palatable. Eventually, Marmite emerged.
We'll make the pastry that's going to go on top of this. And what it really is, it's like a big dumpling. So we're going to use self-raising flour, a few spoonfuls of this. And then the recipe helpfully calls for a lump of butter about the size of an egg. We're using self-raising flour for this, but the recipe actually says if you want to not use chemicals, you know, they're obviously concerned about adulteration and what the chemicals were doing to you, so they say you can not use it, and that works quite well as well, which probably would. It would just not be very light and fluffy. It'd be more like a sort of flat piece of boiled pastry, which might be nice, but it doesn't really feel that much to me. I think it's probably nicer like this.
The fantastic thing about these new vegetarian brands like Marmite,
yeah, that should fit,
is that you know that what you're eating is pure, it's guaranteed, it's been done under almost laboratory-type circumstances. Nobody's been fiddling with your food.
OK, so we're just going to drop this in here. So we've got that all bubbling away. There we go. We're going to leave that for 45 minutes and then come back and it should be ready.
Vegetarians may have taken to it, but Marmite wasn't really intended for them. In fact, it was supposed to be a cheap substitute for a food product which had a special place in Edwardian society: beef extract.
With the huge boom in meat extracts, Bovril came onto the market in the 1880s, followed by a raft of new products. I mean, everybody was clamouring into this really expensive market. Must have been turning over huge sums of money because every major company wanted a little dabble of the profit that was going in this.
Most people in Edwardian Britain ate as much meat as they could afford.
When I was a nipper, only 6 months old, my mother and my father too, they didn't know what to wean me on, they were in a dreadful stew. They thought of...
I think it's difficult to overestimate the importance of meat. I think it's symbolic almost of Edwardian diet. The reason being that not so much that they consumed large amounts of it, but because of its apparent nutritional value for hard physical work, and the fact that all the nutritional authorities were all still followers of the idea that meat makes muscle.
The meat extracts advertised themselves as an alternative to expensive fresh meat.
Boiled beef and carrots, boiled beef and carrots, that's the stuff for your Derby tail, makes you fat and it keeps you well, don't live like vegetarians, both they give to parrots, the wife of mine looks fat and fine on boiled beef and carrots.
The man who started the meat extract boom was a German scientist called Justus von Liebig, whose theories on nutrition had spread across Europe.
Von Liebig was extremely important to science-minded writers of cookery books right back to the mid-19th century. In her original book, Mrs. Beeton is clearly very, very aware of the kind of work he did on extracting marrow from bones, the goodness that you get if you really simmer meat for a long, long time. And when she gives her very elaborate recipes for soup making, she's clearly borrowing from Liebig because she's talking all the time about the importance of simmering those bones to get the maximum goodness that you can out of them.
Not content with theorising about nutrition, Liebig experimented with a little cooking.
He discovered that you could actually use meat, reduce it down to a very small potion, as the advertisements say you could put it into a jar, almost a whole cow it would seem.
Liebig's new meat extract couldn't be made without a source of cheap and plentiful meat. So when the Liebig's Extract of Meat Company was launched in London in 1865, the source of its beef was far away in Uruguay. It was the beginning of the South American processed meat industry.
Beef and carrots, boiled beef and carrots, boiled beef and carrots, that's the stuff for your Derby tail, makes you fat and it keeps you well, don't live like vegetarians, both they give to parrots, since all when you bring up your kids on boiled beef and carrots.
And this became a huge international seller. He was selling millions of these jars every year. And he realised that Liebig's Extract of Meat was a bit of a handful. They decided Lemco, Liebig's Extract of Meat Company, Lemco, was a better way of selling it.
Liebig's extract persuaded generations of housewives of the importance of meat extract to a healthy diet. In 1900, the Liebig Company launched Oxo, a new extract with a more modern image. In keen competition with Bovril, its adverts could be seen everywhere, persuading the public that meat extract was vital for hard physical work. To encourage this connection, Oxo began to support athletic events. It even sponsored the 1908 Olympics. Strangely enough, Justus von Liebig, who started all this in the first place, also invented the yeast extract process. So although Marmite was made by a different company, it owed its existence to Liebig.
OK, now we're going to find out whether it's worked, whether the pastry's risen, and whether it's nice and light and fluffy, or it's just a flat pancake. So, whoa, look at that. Stingray, well, you know, that has risen up. and it's got a nice bit of colour from the veg, and so that's ready, so we can take it to the table and serve it. That looks lovely.
Hello, Matthew.
Hi there, here we go. And this is sea pie.
Uh-huh.
I'm not quite sure where the nautical theme comes from.
Because presumably there's absolutely no fish in it.
There's no fish in it, no, and I suppose it was meant to make it more palatable, more exciting, the idea that it might have, you know, it wasn't quite so weird just eating vegetables that you were getting.
Is this cabbage, in fact? Yes, right. It doesn't scrub up nicely in a pie, does it, cabbage?
It doesn't look a little leathery, shall we say. I mean, this is very plain food, isn't it? It's very sort of quite understandably old-fashioned, and which would be weird if it wasn't, because it is a recipe from 100 years ago.
Now tell me about this gravy, because I wouldn't know that there was Marmite in there. I might think it was just the juices from the vegetables.
Well, I hope so, anyway.
Okay.
But, well, it's got a, if you taste it, it's got a sort of slightly more savoury tang to it. I think it's from the Marmite.
And is that how people used Marmite? That's what they thought of it, as a sort of stock enhancer? They weren't putting it on a couple of slices of toast for breakfast at this point?
Maybe. I mean, it was quite a recent invention, so they may not have worked out what the best thing to do with it. But it definitely was used as a stock, and there were lots of other. I mean, there were meat stocks as well that had a similar sort of flavour range that people used. But I think it was more as a cooking aid at first.
I'm quite intrigued by the fact that this first generation of proprietary vegetarian brands are very much kind of trying to pretend that they're meat, but they're not meat, as it were. So they're kind of trying to pretend to people, look, we're almost like meat, but we're not really, because you get those strange brand names like Protos and everything that sounds like we're almost meat. Because Marmite is actually the French word for stock pot.
And it was that round pot, and in fact the same shape. You know, obviously
right. So
you know, a Marmite was this bulbous pot that you'd have sat in the fire, you know.
So it says goodness and it says slow food, in a sense.
And they were trying to make the connection in people's minds that it was a rich stock that you could use, you know, and it was a part of labelling and marketing and creating a brand.
So what kind of people were these kind of early generations of vegetarians? Because I get the sense that they were probably quite earnest, quite into improving themselves. It doesn't sound glamorous, I have to say.
Well, I mean, I think there was a mixture of the sort of progressive working classes who were, you know, joining cycling clubs and, you know, Methodism and teetotalism and, you know, there would have been that whole background.
So it's a bit of a political act. It's about sort of self-improvement.
Yeah, I think so. And, you know, self-improvement both in sort of spiritual terms but also in physical terms, that, you know, people were thinking that meat was sort of... Clogging you up.
I came across this extraordinary phrase which was, it was everybody's duty to be independent of the abattoir. And I just thought, well, put like that, you'd want to be, wouldn't you? It's such a horrible phrase.
Yes, yeah, well, I mean, and of course it was, the abattoirs then were much more in your face, you know, it was something that you'd see happening around you. A friend of mine said his grandmother remembered seeing the cattle being slaughtered on Market Road and the blood running down the gutters.
Sites like these weren't going to put most Edwardians off their meat, but in 1906 a novel appeared that did change their view of tinned and preserved meat. Written by Upton Sinclair, The Jungle exposed the awful conditions of the Chicago meatpacking industry.
Home consumption. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor in the dirt and sawdust where the workers had tramped and spit uncounted billions of consumption germs. And the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it.
It's to do with the mass slaughtering of animals on a production line. And if you thought that Henry Ford had invented mass production, when you read The Jungle, you realise that the mass production had been invented at least by the American meat packers in their line production methods of slaughtering and parceling up animals and reducing them to the kind of components that then went into their particular products.
The contents of the cans all came out of the same hopper, and then there was potted game, potted ham and deviled ham. Deviled, as the men called it. Deviled ham was made out of the waste ends of smoked beef that were too small to be sliced by the machines. And also tripe, dyed with chemicals so that it would not show white.
The destination of much of the Chicago tinned meat was Britain.
There is widespread scares about the nature of meat products, and the grocery journals report that their sales of tinned meat and meat products went down quite dramatically, and the grocers were extremely worried about it.
Packaged food, once a way of protecting the consumer, had revealed its more unwholesome side. But by 1906, the growth of processed food was unstoppable. For those who were put off their breakfast ham, however, help was at hand.
We're going to do this thing called shredders, using nothing other than our old friend shredded wheat. These are going to be toasted, and we're just going to butter them. Breakfast cereals then, a lot of them were invented by vegetarians. Graham's, in the States, Kellogg's, you know, and it was a health food. Instead of eating, you know, big meaty fry-ups, there was this idea of having this quick, convenient breakfast.
Shredded wheat was part of a wave of new imports from America and Canada, which included Force wheat flakes, Kellogg's cornflakes and grape nuts.
They're part of a new wave of breakfast. No longer the traditional cooked ham and eggs. It's now something which is instant. And of course, this is a growing need for convenience foods as well. You don't cook them, they're easy, they're convenient, but they're also nutritious. They're made from wheat and things like this. And it's digestible.
Oh, lovely golden brown and toasty. So we're just going to pour a little of this delicious possibly Marmite gravy around it, and then you just, I suppose they just ate them like this, you know. These are the famous shredders, which are this interesting idea of baking shredded wheat. You know, so let me serve you a little, and you let me know what you think.
I don't want to be downy again, but it's not. I'm not loving the look.
It isn't hugely appealing, is it? In that sense.
And what's the sauce? It's not Marmite, no.
Well, yes.
Oh, right.
It's a Marmite gravy, which they were very keen on.
Do you know, I could actually get quite used to this. Especially the kind of soggy bit, that's really nice.
So Marmite found favour with vegetarians, but the start of its rise and rise came rather later. At the height of the Great War, troops fighting in hot climates began to fall ill with beriberi. Vitamins had been discovered in 1912, and now medical authorities understood that the illness came from a lack of vitamin B. It was Marmite that was chosen as the best source of the vitamin, and so vast quantities were sent as rations to the front, so much that Marmite had to expand their factory. The war was kind to other brands too. Perrier was able to see off its competitor Apollinaris, which unfortunately was German. Dairy milk, already Cadbury's most successful line in 1914, became comfort food at the front. And when tea supplies were pulled in 1918, Typhoo was given an exemption that allowed them to continue to source their special leaf-edged tea after customers wrote hundreds of letters to the government. While it may have taken a war to cement their hold on the British public, the power of these food brands remains one of the Edwardians' most potent legacies.
A stunning film of the Edwardians in colour tomorrow night on BBC4. A unique archive collection at 9.